Hello, guys, gals, 9x9 pals, and everything in between. Cow Kings here again for another fantastic and exciting video. So today, I wanted to sort of talk to you guys about comfort and why you can find enjoyment in discomfort. So let's start with the idea of comfort and what it's supposed to do. So comfort in and of essence allows us to be satisfied with life, allows us to enjoy ourselves and to have a quality life that is sustainable long term. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a good thing to have, because over time, what I've seen a lot of people do is they get worn down, they get beat up by life, and then unfortunately, sometimes in the extreme cases, that can lead to a premature death due to suicide. And so comfort has its place, and one extreme or the other is not important, right? It's actually very harmful. That's whether you be toxic as far as negative, but toxic positivity too. But in this case, I want to talk about at least too much comfort. In another topic, we'll talk about when people are a little too much workaholics, but for now, we'll talk about those who seek too much comfort. So let me paint a scenario for you. You're there, sitting there, you're watching Netflix, but you're not really enjoying Netflix. On your mind is the fact that you got this bill to pay, this errand to run, and you should really be working out because you've been pushing it off all day and it's starting to wind down in the day. You know you really got to get that workout in. And as the clock winds down, this pressure tends to get more and more built up until inevitably some people just crash and burn and say, fuck it, I'll just do it tomorrow. And of course the problem with that becomes is who knows what tomorrow you is going to say, right? If you've changed nothing about your habits and about your dedication, about the way you approach things, then chances are it's going to be the same. Because here's the deal with working out. There are always going to be days where you don't want to wake up. And if you just wait until you feel like it, it's going to be inconsistent. The thing about dedication is that it's every single day. Is that this motivation allows you to be consistent and to reap results, the benefits of your hard work. So there's some factors that go into this. There's chaos, disorder, and then this leads to growth. So think of it like this. You have a fish in a bowl. It's very limited in what it can do and in its enjoyment and in its life. It's in that bowl. It cannot go anywhere. Its environment is very plain. It's very boring. It's very limited. But it's safe. The fish is in no danger from the outside world. Versus if a fish is in a pond, now it's got to worry about potential predators. But it has a lot more freedom. And see, this is the very essence of life, in the fact that to break our limits and to grow each time, we must also accept that there are potential risks with anything that we do. I've seen people grow to be 70 years old at McDonald's, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that if that's what you want to be. But these people have not lived a day in their life. And then they sit there and they complain about how they don't have enough money for anything and how their life is miserable. But again, they don't do anything. And I started thinking, that's pretty scary, but that could be any of us. Because for a lot of individuals, they also had hopes and dreams when they grow up. Like with a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? And obviously this changes over time, but as a child, a good majority of us were very young and ambitious, and we had these hopes and dreams that were large and bigger than anything we could have ever hoped for. But somewhere along the lines, we started getting beaten down by life. Somewhere along the lines, we just forgot who we were. And so, I've also learned that people have it sort of backwards, right? So people will try to build a lot of good habits, okay? Let me give you an example. Let's say, you ever heard the healthy smoker argument? It's a very dumb one, but if you haven't, allow me to elaborate. There are some people who argue they're healthy smokers. But by any means, no matter how you word it, they're a smoker. They'll say, well, I eat a healthy diet, I exercise, I maintain my stress levels, blah, blah, blah. but they smoke. So it doesn't matter how much you do well, right? Because at the end of the day, that one bad habit is so much more detrimental. It's like, let's say you're building a house or something, right? It could take a group of 8, 10, 12 people? I don't know, I'm not an expert, but it takes a group of people, right? And it can take many months of building it, not to mention all the planning that goes into it, making sure you have the funds. But all it takes is one man to come by in a day's worth of time, and he can absolutely bulldoze that house down. And so you see here in this comparison how easy it is to undo all the good things you've done. Let's say you really worked up for a promotion, okay, another good example. And you've been working for 20, 30 years if you're boss or whatever, right? And you really bust your ass to get to a store owner or whatever. If you wanted to, you could go in there and you could fuck that all up in an instant. All you'd have to do is shout racial profanities, punch somebody in the mouth, start pissing all over people, and it's all gone. And to fix that, if you ever could, would take years upon years of due diligence. So I think something that's important is accepting that while it's good to have these good habits, what you need to really focus on is preventing bad habits and not having to do that damage control. Because once you have to do that damage control, it's a real pain in the ass. And I've always learned that rejection is a normal thing. Rejection is, in fact, a good thing. Some people will look at it almost like rejection of the self, as if they themselves were rejected, if they're turned down from a job, like, what's wrong with me? Why wasn't I good enough? But really, it's not personal. Even if it is, what can you do about it? Well, you have a few options. You can certainly sit there and sulk, but that's not going to help. If it's really truly a rejection of the self, then you can focus on, how do I improve myself? How in the future can I learn to do better? How in the future can I prevent this from happening, or at least reduce the chances? And also, how can I just learn to accept that this is a normal part of life? Because the truth is, sometimes radical acceptance goes a long way. In fact, most times I'd even argue. Because the thing about life is, as I mentioned previously, there's always risk to get any benefit. And I find that for a lot of people, if they spend as much time as they do making excuses as they did trying, then who knows where they could be. Some of the things people will say, and the most used excuses that I've heard, are that people have great careers because they're lucky, or because they're built different, or because they met different people, or they're geniuses. And certainly, there's some validity to some of these, which makes them so palpable. And it also helps to comfort the blow on ourselves that maybe perhaps we could have done better. But the truth is, that's just not the case with a lot of people. At least that's not in its entirety. Because I've learned you can either get jealous or inspired. If you're really wondering how people get to where they are, it's important to ask them, how? How? If you have a friend who's doing very well off, and if they're willing to spare the time for you, sit down and talk to them and ask them how they got to this point. And ask them if they can put you with any connections or any people that they might know. And this could be a good first step. Because comfort will affect your self-esteem. If you're already feeling bad, then you might feel even worse at the prospect of never having done anything or not reaching your full potential. So the dream is there, but people are waiting for the motivation. The truth is that sometimes that motivation just is not going to come. When you're comfy, you're sipping your hot cup of cocoa, and you're relaxed, you got your feet kicked up on your recliner, it's really easy. But when you're out there in the trenches and you're sweating your ass off working out, and you're thinking, man, this fucking sucks, it's hard to still be motivated, because at the other end of that is the idea of going home and eating a $5 large pizza from Little Caesars. And that sounds really, really tempting. Especially in those moments where, oh, well, now it's just become real. Which is why you need to remind yourself that on the other side of discomfort is victory. Because you see, for exercise, any weightlifter, any runner will tell you that progress takes time. And I think the reason exercise is so good is because you can physically see your results. So I take my watch and I always look at each run I do. And I look at the results of what I have, and it's very obvious. But when you can't see that, it can sometimes be discouraging. The important thing to keep in mind is even if you can't see it, it's still happening. The fact that you got off the couch in the first place is progress. The alternative is you could just do nothing. And I think it's important to work smart and not hard. Don't just bust your ass and then leave no time for yourself and you're worn out and you hate yourself. Even if you have to take it slow, that's okay. Because the truth is, this is a marathon and not a race. We don't want to rush ourselves until we're burnt out and then we end up back in the same spot and we're like, well, fuck this. Something that I find that helps is to break stuff down into the simplest steps possible. You take a list of things, right? Sit down and write a list of things that you want to do, that you want to accomplish. And out of that list, look for the easiest thing that you can see on there. And then, what is the first step you can take towards that? What is the most manageable step? Because when you look at it as a whole, it can be quite overwhelming. So it's important to break it down into small steps, so that way, it doesn't seem so overwhelming. I always do stuff for me personally because I know others aren't. When I work out, it's because I know somebody out there isn't. When I do these videos, I know somewhere out there isn't. And I know that doing good for others can feel good. If you ever feel like you're a bad person, there's no self-esteem, what you need to do is to help others. And in turn, this will build your self-esteem, and you'll be making a real difference that you can see in other people's lives and the way they improve. And this is also good because then you have a support system. In a time where many people are lonely, it's important to look out for one another and do some volunteer work. Hell, even just make a video on YouTube, stream. Because you'll be surprised how many people are going through the same thing you are. And I think it's also important to find a passion. Now, passions and interests are very different. Everybody's got interest, multiple interests. You need to find a passion, something you're truly obsessed with. And you have to accept that there's going to be a lot of sacrifices that you have to make for that passion. And then you have to weigh whether or not those sacrifices are worth it. And during that time, you need to focus on it like you've never focused on something before. Because when you have your hand in too many cookie jars, you tend to get distracted, and then you become a jack of all trades and a master of none. I think what's also important is to look at life and ask, what is it that your tombstone is going to say? Will it be a great career or a missed opportunity? Here lies Jack. He was alright. That's something that scares me, is being forgotten about. A lot of people look at fear and they run away from things that are uncomfortable. They run away from things that they're not sure of. They turn down promotions that they just think they're going to fail at. And I don't think fear is necessarily a bad thing. I don't think anxiety is a bad thing either, because the essence of fear and anxiety is it saves you from dangerous situations. It saves you from that lion to make you run away, or it saves you from that bad neighborhood when you get that feeling. However, equally important is to assess that fear and be rational about it, and to use it as a compass. So for me, sometimes when I'm looking at stuff that I know I should do and I'm afraid, I use it as a compass and I say, okay, I recognize this, and I distance myself from that fear. And I say, I notice I'm having the feeling that this is scary. And by talking like that, it distances myself from that emotion. It gives me some space to breathe and think on it. And I use that fear as a compass to direct me towards the things that I know I should be doing the most. I always think that the worst things you can say are but, and, unless, and, if only I had phrases. Because this puts the responsibility off on other people. And by talking like this, it prevents us from looking at ourselves and really growing. If we can blame the whole world and say it's the world's fault, that's a lot easier than asking, what could I have done better? Because it's the world's fault, and that means there's nothing we could do about it. But if it's our fault, then that means there's some real reflection we need to do. That means there might have been things, years of our lives, people we have around, jobs we've worked, that all need to be reassessed. And that's a lot harder. And so it's so important to step outside, because when you're only looking at it from your perspective, you might have, everybody has their biases. Everybody has their beliefs and their personal anecdotes and experiences. And this can create a really narrow view of the world. And so I think it's important to look at it from multiple perspectives. We live in a time where information and technology is so readily available. At the click of a button, you can search up anything you want online. And more than likely, you can find thousands of answers on that same topic. And so it's important to keep in mind that even though we all go through different stuff, we're all going through something. And you never know. So what I recommend is to look at all these people who've gone through stuff and figure out how they did it themselves. Because when you're only looking at it through your eyes, this narrow lens, you start to get tunnel vision. And you might be missing the bigger picture. Which is why I like a glass half full instead of a glass half empty approach. I always stay cautiously optimistic. I hope for the best and I prepare for the worst. Because I recognize that the constant stress of cortisol is not only physically bad, but mentally and emotionally it's going to wear on you like nothing else. So there are a couple ways that people do change. There are three main ways. One is when life forces on you. I've seen this with drug addicts, where they hit rock bottom, they lose their kid, and they're at the point where they're going to die if they don't change. The second being when peers influence you. This could be a teacher, or this could be a professor, or anybody else. And the last is when you are proactive about it. I think the most important thing is a combination of the second and third one. Because when you let life choose for you, not only is there a lot of unneeded pain that you really didn't have to go through, but you might not like how life chooses for you to do it. You cannot get back that time that you wasted. And I understand it might be discouraging. You might even do worse off when you're first working. Because progress is not linear. There are sometimes setbacks. And it might feel off. But much like when you're training to do something new on the job or in college, everybody starts from somewhere. And people tend to default to what they know. And that's bullshit. That'll only keep you the same person. This is not about winning or losing. You have to keep that in mind. This is about getting better. And so at first, you might even do worse with these new approaches to life. But it's important to keep in mind long term that this is not going to be this way forever, and you will adapt and overcome. So the last couple things that I'd like to talk about as we wind this down is how we handle bad things. Bad things for me are always going to be valuable lessons. They're going to teach me what not to do and what worked. Bad things are going to act as reminders, as cautionary tales. And bad things are the best ways to learn. And that's how I like to look at them. Because the alternative is you start going, woe is me and woe is me. And unfortunately, as much as people don't want to hear this, the truth is, it could always get worse. Sitting there if you have bad coping mechanisms and you turn to them when you're feeling sad, let's say you stress eat or something. That was my big one, right? And when bad things happened to me, I felt sorry for myself. I tried to make myself a little more comfortable. And in those moments when I said, why me, and I let myself be so negative about bad shit, I would turn to these coping mechanisms. And if they're not good, then those only add to the pain. And then this cycle sort of feeds into and of itself. Which is why it's important to keep your head up. Because you're with your own self-talk 24/7. You live with yourself all the time. And if your self-talk is not good, now imagine somebody says something to you bad, right? They call you a piece of shit or something. That already sits with you. But they only said that for a few seconds or minutes or whatever. Let's say a customer at work is something difficult. But we don't even pay attention to how bad we talk about ourselves, how bad we talk about the situations in our lives. And we're doing that all day long. It's affecting you. You're just not paying as much attention to it as to even really notice it. Because it's just normal for you. But the truth is that shouldn't be normal. And so, people sometimes will go on social media and when they're feeling bad, they'll see all these people who have these Bugattis and shit. But the thing you're not seeing is that these are just highlights that they're carefully selecting of their lives. And yes, some people have it better. Some people absolutely do. And the question I ask is, what about it? It's always important to remain grateful for what we have and to never forget where we came from. The fact that you are alive at this current moment in history is huge. And it can always get worse, as I've said many times. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't want better or you shouldn't strive to improve. You absolutely should. But the truth is that these moments are so precious because these moments you don't get to rewind. Life in of itself. If you were trying to fast forward and only look at the highlights of your life, whatever that definition is, you would find that you'd end up in the end of your life way faster than you ever anticipated. And then you're like, well, what the hell now? If you're young, even if you're broke, at least be appreciative you're broke. Be appreciative that you have 2 arms or 2 legs, you can talk, or you can watch this video right here, or listen to this video right now. Be appreciative that there are friends or family members or whoever that loves and cares about you. Because life can always get worse. So, let's talk about what it is with death and mortality. I hate the idea of death. But in a way, I'm grateful for it. Because with death, it's created a sense of urgency in me. Because I am reminded that I need to prepare for mortality and that tomorrow isn't promised. We like to have these ideas that we grow really old. And in that old age, we die peacefully. The truth is, however, we're not guaranteed. There's a million ways we could die. There's a million ways of which, even if we don't die, our life quality might not be the highest. Which is why I say to enjoy these current moments, because you don't know how good they are until you don't have them. I remember hearing the saying that a healthy man wants a million things, and a sick man just wants to be healthy again. So when you're sitting here listening to this video thinking about how bad life is, I want you to remind yourself and really sort of ask, is this so bad? And even if it is, how can I at least try to maximize my enjoyment so I don't cause any more suffering than I already am? So, with that being said, I think that the other issue, of course, is that people have these personas, that they're never themselves. They work certain jobs, they do certain fields, they act a certain way because they're scared of being judged. And there's some points where that can really wear on an individual. I've talked about this before, but it's important that you keep people in your life who are not going to judge you, who you can genuinely be yourself around. And of course, there's always etiquette that you behave because you don't want to lose your job or because it's just the right thing to do. If you go out to dinner, it's expected that you have a certain level of professionalism or a certain level of engagement with the people that you're having dinner with. And so there are some good etiquettes and there's some good expectations that really help set up for a successful and good human being. And you wouldn't just want to completely disregard how other people act. But a lot of people I've noticed, they're living this life where it's like they're not really being themselves. There's the idea of what people think of them, and they're trying to live up to that idea. And that it can be a real tragedy. It weighs on a person. It can make them start thinking, does anybody really love me? Because what they love is just the idea of me. So what do we do? Well, of course, the first step is recognizing that everybody else is doing this to some degree too. And if you really want, then find the people who love you the most. And the way you're going to do that is only by taking the risk of exposing yourself and opening up. And at worst, maybe those people end up not liking you. But it's a blessing in disguise. Because at least that way you're not going to waste another 5, 10, 15, 20 years on what could be used on a better relationship, on a better friendship. And when you're going on vacations, by the way, make sure you pay attention to that. Because sometimes what happens is people become soft. They kick back in that jacuzzi, they relax, and they don't think about doing anything productive, and they're like, well, I've earned this. Maybe. Maybe you have. But maybe not. So that's why it's important to ask yourself, not just on vacations, but whenever you're relaxing at home or anything, is this really something you should be doing? Now, see, I'm not promoting this toxic hyper-productivity work until your back breaks. But what I am suggesting to you is that the longer you wait for stuff to do, the bigger your to-do list becomes. There's all these things that people know they should do, but they've never sat down and actually wrote them out. They've had overdue things that they could have done, going to the doctors, going to the dentist, or seeing a therapist, or going on a dinner date with a partner. They've had all these overdue things. And they've always been there. They've just paid them no mind. What are your values? Like, what type of person do you want to be? And then try to live that way like that person. Try to live that way like that person right now. Now maybe you want a Bugatti or something, and in that sense, you can't necessarily live that way day one. If you did, you'd be stupid. But for example, let's say somebody's overweight, and they think, well, if I just lost weight, I could exercise. Well, what's to say you can't live like that right now? Sure, you can't run. But if you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. Hell, even if you're disabled in a wheelchair, what helps? Just lift some weights. Maybe give some light punches, or maybe roll around a little bit. Live like the person you want to be. And sometimes there will be limitations to that. Or even if you're shy, live like you're not shy. Fake it till you make it. Over time, you will get used to this due to a thing called neuroplasticity. It will start feeling more and more natural as you continue on. Just ask yourself, what would that person do? That person you've created in your mind. What I've seen sometimes with a lot of boxers is they create these alter egos when they're going into box, like Deontay Wilder, for example. And there's a lot of reasons, but the main one is that sense of undying confidence, where we can temporarily put aside our worries, our fears, our inhibitions, all these what ifs. We could spend all day asking what if. We could come up with a million reasons. We're really good at it. On why we can't do something or why we shouldn't do something. And it's those lies we tell ourselves that are the worst ones of them all. And so people are looking for this thing of, well, how do I get rid of self-doubt? How do I get rid of that lack of self-trust? How do I get rid of that fear? You never really ever get rid of it. What you can learn to do is recognize it for what it is, a feeling, and that it will pass. And that in this moment, regardless of what you're feeling, to try your best. You're thinking too much about shit sometimes. People sometimes overcomplicate stuff. when I play a fighting game like Super Smash Bros., I play at a pretty high level. And sometimes I'll overthink it. And all that time that I spent overthinking it, I could have spent on just playing the game and not worrying about the result. And when you're not worrying about the result, you can be more in the moment. Meditation is so important to practice that flow state. Because if you're not all there, if you're not giving it your full attention, that means you're not operating at maximum capacity. And so that means you never really were being your best self. And you're just getting in your own way. You cannot multitask. It's just not efficient. Try cooking a bunch of items in the kitchen at once and see how well you do versus if you just focus on one food item at a time. The same way you autopilot driving where you don't even think about it, try to get to that level of comfortability with other things like cooking, like wrestling, like jiu-jitsu, like gaming. Try to get so good at those things that you have that level of comfortability. That doesn't mean you don't think. It just means you have the same level of comfortability. And try to think of it with that same mindset of, I can just do this. Those million thoughts racing in your head, it's going to absolutely drive you insane, man. And you know it. And I think a big issue is sometimes fear comes from like these previous experiences, right? And it is natural. And like I said, you can't be fearless. And in fact, it can be good for you. And I think that's the tricky thing about fear. Because let's say, for example, back to the whole thing about dangerous towns. You don't want to be around a dangerous person or a dangerous neighborhood. You don't want to go into a prison and just, when you're feeling scared because that one dude killed 12 people, you don't just want to ignore that. But equally, you have to recognize and stop for a moment and sit back. So what I like to do is sometimes if I'm feeling like I don't want to do something, I like to sit back for a moment and I go, okay, does this make sense? And then I ask myself, how is this serving me? And I write down a pros and cons list. As I'm writing down that list, I just take a few moments so I'm not so overwhelmed, and that allows me to think more rationally. Because when you're caught up in that moment and right then and there, it can feel very overwhelming, and we might make rash decisions that later on will be like, man, fuck, shoulda, woulda, coulda. And that does not help us at all. So, for each of the reasons that you write down, problem solve those reasons. Because what you need to do is you need to plan ahead for stuff, right? Because if you don't, people like to think they'll rise to the occasion, but they fall to what they know. If somebody is used to fleeing and running away in conflict, and then they end up in that conflict and it's unexpected and it's super stressful and really overwhelming, they're likely going to run because that's all they know. That's just what they've practiced at, whether or not they realize or not. That's what they've always defaulted to. So that's what they've practiced the most, and that's muscle memory for them at that point. And when you plan for outcomes, even if they're unlikely, at least this way when it happens, you're more likely to be prepared and not caught off guard and go, whoa, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed. What the hell do I do now? Planning out schedules, for example, setting reminders of doctor's appointments or whatever else. Because if you forget your doctor's appointment, then all of a sudden, I don't know if you had done this, you look and you get a call or a reminder and it tells you, hey, you have a doctor's appointment. You haven't scheduled that day off. Oh my God, it's going to be a lot harder than if you tried to get that day off of work 2 weeks ahead of time during that doctor's appointment than if you try to do it same day and try to rush to have someone cover your shift. Now, maybe it might work for you, but it's certainly not nearly as easy. So, with all that being said, thank you guys for listening. Just keep in mind that other people are going through this, and it gets easier with time. This is a challenging prospect, but there are so many ways to handle this. Believe in yourself. Do not make this overcomplicated. Just get to the point of comfortability, like if you're driving a car, that you can have that same autopilot flow state mindset as you can with some of your hobbies and professions. Thank you guys so much. Until next time, this is Cow Kings. signing off.